Hi there, this is David from Honest IELTS. Glad you could be here. Now, when I was an IELTS examiner, something I experienced many times was this. An IELTS candidate would be in front of me. They were clearly very intelligent. They knew a lot of grammar. They knew a lot of vocabulary. They had prepared. But I was spending so much time trying to understand what they were saying that it was almost impossible to assess any of these things. The students' pronunciation was making it impossible to give them a good score. Now, it wasn't the student's accent that was really the problem. That's important to understand. IELTS does not give you a lower band score for having an accent. It never has. But when an accent is so strong that it creates a problem for the examiner to understand you, then it may change what your final score is. So this is something to work on. Now, it's important to be clear. The goal is not to sound like a native speaker. The goal is something different, intelligibility. That means being understood clearly and without effort in an IELTS speaking exam by the examiner. I think the interesting thing is that candidates who do have problems being clear in the exam sometimes think it is about accent and maybe about individual sounds, but it often isn't. They're having problems because of other issues with pronunciation and features of speech that can be worked on directly and which are not necessarily affecting your accent. So this is what this video is about. How can we work on these specific things to improve our intelligibility? Let's start by looking at some of the criteria used in the IELTS speaking exam. One of the 4 criteria for your speaking is pronunciation. It's worth 25% of your score. As an example, let's see what Band 7 says for pronunciation. It says, uses a range of pronunciation features with mixed control, shows some effective use of features, but this is not sustained. Now, Band 6 says, uses a range of pronunciation features, but with limited control, often makes errors that sometimes cause difficulty for the listener. That's, I think, the key phrase there, causes difficulty for the listener. At Band 6 and below, phrases like this are often used in the descriptors. When it becomes very difficult for the examiner to understand what the candidate is saying, this is going to limit the score you can get for pronunciation and probably for speaking as a whole. So, the examiner's not sitting there thinking, does this person sound like a native speaker? They're saying, can I follow this person without difficulty? And this is something you can work on to get better at with the right kind of practice. A lot of pronunciation practice and a lot of advice you'll find online and in the classroom from teachers will focus on individual sounds. The th sound in think, the difference between v and b, or v and w, the short I sound in ship versus the long E sound in sheep. Now, these are useful and important differences. But here's the problem. Practicing these sounds just in isolation and by themselves, one at a time, is not really going to help you with real speech. Real speech is continuous. The sounds in a sentence are connected to each other and are sort of affected by sort of rhythm and stress. As a teacher, it's quite easy to make a student say a particular sound accurately and correctly. But when they go to use it in a sentence and they're speaking naturally, they make that mistake with the sound again. When a candidate has spent a lot of time practicing sort of individual sounds, they can sometimes sound a little bit unnatural when they speak. Each word is carefully produced, but the flow is wrong. And it is that flow of language that makes it easier to understand. Someone speaking more naturally and with a natural flow will be easier to understand, even if they sometimes make mistakes with individual sounds. The two features that cause the most difficulty for listeners are stress and rhythm. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. Okay, so let's make this really clear. A candidate who speaks with clear stress and rhythm, even with an accent, is often easier to understand than a candidate who speaks with careful sounds but flat, unstressed speaking. So we're going to look at 4 specific things to work on. These are not tricks, they are the features that make the biggest difference to intelligibility, and each one can be practiced independently and together. One area that will definitely make your accent clearer is word stress. Every word in English with more than one syllable has a stressed syllable, one that is sort of longer and louder and slightly higher in pitch. For example, let's look at these 3 words. Photograph, photography, photographic. Now you can see these are quite similar words and they have the same sort of basic start, but the stress changes depending on the ending. English stress is not always predictable, but it is consistent. A common problem I observed as an examiner was candidates placing stress on the wrong syllable. Not mispronouncing the sound, but misplacing the emphasis. This can cause real problems. When a student says, I like deserts rather than I like desserts, that really does change the meaning. So, as a practical step, when you learn a new word, learn its stress pattern at the same time. Not as a sort of a separate thing, just say the word with its correct stress right from the beginning. If you've been saying a word incorrectly for a long time, this will take a bit of effort and work at first, but it will become automatic quickly. And remember to practice using it in a sentence that is likely to come up in the exam. So when you learn photography, write down some useful sentences like, I took up photography a few years ago, or I find photography a really interesting hobby. These are the kinds of things that might come up, for example, in part 1 of the speaking exam. Using these words in sentences will make it more likely to use them correctly in the exam. So, word stress is about syllables within words, but sentence stress is about which words in a sentence carry the main emphasis or stress. In English, content words such as nouns, adjectives, adverbs, these are typically stressed. Function words, the small words like articles, prepositions, pronouns, auxiliary verbs, they are normally unstressed, and often we say them sort of quicker and shorter than normal. This is what gives English its rhythm, this pattern of strong and weak sounds. Not every language does this. When a speaker produces every word the same with no change, the listener loses the ability to pick out the key information quickly. The sentence becomes a flat line of sound. Okay, let's take a look at this sentence, for example. Listen how I say it with the words in capitals stressed. I want to talk about the role of technology in education. You can see those words want, talk, role, technology, education are much clearer and easier to understand than I, to, about, the, in. Listen again. I'll say it a little faster. I want to talk about the role of technology in education. We could say the stressed words by themselves and the meaning would still be clear. Want, talk, role, technology, education. So you can see in the sentence the stressed words carry the meaning. The unstressed words sort of hold the grammar together, but they do not need to be heard as clearly. A candidate who stresses all words equally is making their listener work much harder than necessary. You can practice this with example sentences you might use in the exam. Practice just saying the key words, but then saying the sentence again and add in the less important words, but try not to say them so clearly or loudly as the key words. This will prepare you really well for creating that nice sort of flow and rhythm in English. Another thing that will really help you sound more natural and clear in English is to understand about one of the most common sounds in English, the schwa. The schwa is the most common vowel sound in spoken English. It is the neutral, sort of unstressed vowel, the sound at the beginning of about or around. It's the sound at the end of words like teacher, mother, brother, player. In phonetics, it's written like this. You may be familiar with that. Most non-native speakers do not use the schwa enough because often in their language, they do not have vowels which are like this, which are reduced and are not pronounced clearly. In English, these unstressed vowels are regularly reduced to a schwa in natural speech. When you do not reduce them, the pattern disappears. Compare these two versions of the same sentence. Listen to this first way of saying it. I want to go to the shop. Now, the more natural way to say this would be, I want to go to the shop. You can see that I want to becomes wanna. Oh, that's the schwa sound. And I want to go to. Again, this is the schwa sound. That second one will always sound more natural than the first. So, the practical step for you is, listen to natural spoken English and pay attention specifically to these sort of weak, reduced sounds that become the schwa. Start noticing it and start practicing using those vowels in your own speech. Another technique that will help make you more intelligible is what's called shadowing. Shadowing is a technique where you listen to a native speaker and repeat what they say in real time with a delay of about half a second. You're not waiting for them to finish. You're following just behind them, matching their rhythm, their speed, and their intonation as closely as you can. What makes shadowing different from simply repeating sentences is that you're doing it almost at the same time. You're processing sound and producing speech at the same time. This builds the sort of memory and the ear together, which is how fluent speakers actually produce language. The content for shadowing does not need to be IELTS material. In fact, it's probably better to use more natural material, a podcast, a TED talk, a documentary. This works better than scripted content because the speech patterns are a little more natural. Start with slow, clear speakers, increase speed as your ability to do it improves. 30 minutes of shadowing done over several weeks produces noticeable changes in rhythm and flow. If you want to practice this more, there are many great videos on YouTube that will show you the practical steps for doing it. Okay, so let's just summarize what are those 4 things you need to do. The 4 techniques are working on word stress from the beginning when you learn vocabulary. Practice sentence stress by identifying which words are the important ones and carry the meaning. Practice the schwa sound when using natural flowing speech. Use shadowing to build rhythm through repetition. I want to come back now to something I talked about at the beginning. I said at the beginning that this video is not really about accent reduction. Your accent is part of who you are. It carries information about your background, your language, your culture. A Brazilian accent in English is not a problem. A Japanese accent is not a problem. What matters is whether the person listening to you can follow your speech without effort. The research on this is clear. Intelligibility and accent are not the same thing. You can have an accent and be understood. The features that affect intelligibility most, stress, rhythm, reducing vowel sounds, are not what make your accent your accent. They are technical features of English that can be adjusted without changing the basic character of your speech. Work on those features. You can keep everything else. Just be aware None of this is fast. Pronunciation work takes time, but it gets better with consistent practice in a way that some other aspects of English do not. Every hour you put in will produce real, measurable change. That is worth knowing. Okay, if this was useful, please share it with someone who is preparing for IELTS or just want to improve their English. There's a link in the description to join the Honest IELTS WhatsApp and Facebook communities where I share practice tasks and answer questions directly. There's also a link to my website where you can sign up for a free 20-minute consultation and maybe find out a bit about what areas of your pronunciation you need to work on. In the description, there is also a document sort of summarizing these key pronunciation areas that you can go away and practice. Hope you found it useful and hope to see you in the next video. See you later. Bye.